So many of the things that I thought I had done intuitively as a prosecutor, I got from this movie. When you ask people, can you be fair, impartial, and unbiased? I bet there's maybe one or two people in this room who would raise their hand and say, I can't be. Up until about my 10th trial in the DA's office, I had lost 2 back-to-back. And I went in to my supervisor and said to him, I don't know what I did wrong. And he said to me, jurors don't want to convict. It is emotionally very hard for people to sit in judgment of others. Part of your job as a prosecutor is to make them understand that this is their obligation.
The Supreme Court's record during this time period was not one of promoting freedom. And so if all you knew about America was watching this film, you would see the court as this bastion of freedom and justice and so forth. And this was really not. It was really the issue, did they prove that these people were born in Africa? It was good for the people.
So there was, if you were here, you were illegally here.
Yeah,
right? You were
yeah.
Smuggled in illegally.
Exactly.
But this point, which
yeah.
is why you're saying this is such a narrow legal
It's
issue.
a narrow legal issue. It's not a grand principle of truth, justice, and the American way.
Death is death. And it was same in the old days as it is now. All it is that, Schopenhauer said it nicely. He says, sleep is a bit of death borrowed. Every day we borrow a bit of death. Because when you sleep and do not dream, what is there? What is there? You can't even talk about it. Can you describe that situation? You can talk about a dream, but that's not death. You're living in another world, another time. And that's as real as the world you're in now. The person observing the dreamer is in a whole different world than what he thinks he's in. See? But when there's consciousness gone, there's nothing. So dreamless sleep is like a bit of death borrowed. And we should remember that. And when all this mythology about death then falls into a pile of nothing.
We have to stop engaging in magical thinking. The magical thinking is, well, if we just say there'll be sanctions on them, they're not going to do it. Or if we just say you're really, really bad people, they're not going to do it. The sad fact for anyone trying to fashion policy is that you have to be willing to use force to stop many or to stop would-be genocidal leaders. That's just the reality. The radical thing is the status quo. And the status quo is we sit by and watch as hundreds of thousands and millions of people get slaughtered. And beyond that, many more hundreds of thousands, millions have their lives utterly destroyed by being expelled from their homes into the most horrible of circumstances. That is utterly radical. What is more radical than that?
There's almost like a Talmudic thing that's happening in this film that's going through it. And it keeps touching, sort of like an old knowledge, an old order that we instinctively know. The last scene where Pacino changes his mind, his life is over. And that could only be buttressed against the wisdom, although they're losing their powers, get it? The older men are losing their powers, but that decision is buttressed against that scene in the old age home. And that's really struck me. It took me, I had to get older to see that.
The movie is predicated, obviously it's titled this, it's predicated on the notion of what is justice. And in fact, so many courtroom dramas are really whodunits, but they're not whodunits about who committed the crime.
Right.
The real whodunit is, will justice prevail? Will the system work? As I said earlier, it almost always works, and then we leave the theater and we say, thank God. And every so often, and now more frequently, we see that the system doesn't work. So the whodunit is, does justice prevail? Here it doesn't. From 67, which is Bonnie and Clyde, through 79 is one of the most fertile periods in American film. It's the period of Robert Altman. It's the period of Scorsese. It's the period of Coppola. It's a period of Norman Jewison, who is, I think, an underrated director. Now, one of the reasons that you have all of these filmmakers coming into that breach is that American movies commercially are at a very low ebb in the 1960s, and no one can figure out what to do to bring audiences back. But here you've got these young filmmakers who can do anything because there's nothing at stake. There's no risk. Nobody's going to the movies anyway.
Being a Georgia boy, I've just got to tell you that it wasn't quite as black and white as it seems, and this was just a bunch of crazy people running around down there, because that wasn't true. People here don't understand what it's like to have been living in a part of the country that was defeated and occupied, and people believed in their cause, not necessarily slavery, but just the agrarian way of life back in the 1860s, and they fought for it and they died for it, and then the men who did come home that were maimed, lost their land to taxes. They were humiliated, and that's takes 100 and something years to begin to get past that.
In the years and the decades that followed, the Atlanta Jews strongly resisted any reopening of the case or...
Because they wanted to pretend it didn't happen.
Right, exactly. There was a...
It was too horrible. But anybody of my parents, my grandparents' generation, I remember being a little boy and people would bring up the name of Leo Frank, and they would just get up and walk out of the room. And that's what got me so interested.
Look what happened to the grandson.
What did he do? Never mind. I had to go to the library when I was old enough to ride the bus by myself to figure out what he did.
Well, the New York Times took up the case, Adolph Oakes, the publisher, and someone wrote that this was the first and the last time that the New York Times ever became a crusading newspaper on an issue like this, especially because, very much like the Hollywood moguls, Adolph Oakes and the family that owned the New York Times did everything they could to de-emphasize that the ownership was Jewish.